Hello, Tom Cheshire here on The Daily, and we're talking about the war in Gaza again. But today the focus is on the UK and its supply of weapons to Israel. The government's been warned to stop arms exports to the country, and that comes in the wake of that attack on the aid convoy where 7 people were killed by the Israel Defense Forces. Stopping arms sales to Israel is one of the demands of this letter to the Prime Minister. It's been signed by hundreds of well-respected lawyers, academics, and we'll be speaking to one of them later on the podcast. But first, our political correspondent, Rob Powell, joins me. Looking at this letter, the demands in it, I was down at the Palestine Solidarity Campaign march covering that on Saturday. The demand's pretty similar, especially this call for an end to supplying Israel with weapons, with arms. But this letter, it feels like it's putting a lot of pressure on the Prime Minister, on all sorts of people. Why has it moved the debate on so much?
Probably partly because of the names that have signed this. You've got 600 people that have signed this, really a roll call of some of the most respected, most senior former judges in this country, people like Lady Hale, former chair of the Supreme Court, people like Lord Sumption as well. And look, when it comes to people like Lord Sumption, he's someone that you can't kind of place him, if you like, of where he falls on certain debates. He tends to, I don't think he's very tribal in the way that he views certain debates. So I think when people like that put their name to something, others start listening and it is heard within Whitehall. When it comes to arms export licenses, a huge part of this is about the legal judgment and the law and the technical side of it. And then there is sort of the politics and the geopolitics and the sort of domestic politics that is maybe makes up a smaller part of it. They are very focused on basically the risk that the UK could be complicit in the breaking of international humanitarian law by continuing to allow there to be licenses for weapons to be sent there. So essentially how it works, that if you're going to license a weapon to be sold and exported, then you have to be sure that it is not going to be used to break international humanitarian law. What these lawyers and former judges are doing in this 17-page letter, it's basically a kind of legal opinion really, is that they're looking at things like the provisional order from the International Court of Justice. They're looking at numbers to do with civilian deaths and injuries, how readily aid is able to get in, the risk of famine and starvation and things like that. And they're saying that there is a risk that if the UK doesn't alter course, it could be complicit in what they believe could be infringements of international humanitarian law.
As you say, there's a huge amount of people who've signed this from all sides of the political spectrum. We'll be speaking to one of those who signed it later in the podcast. When it comes to actually the headline thing here about suspending arms sales to Israel, we don't sell much arms to Israel. That it wouldn't make a tangible difference. So the political side, the idea that the UK would just say this, that becomes more important than really the effect of however much it is we do send to Israel.
I think there was a Foreign Office minister who said that UK exports, as a percentage of weapons imports into Israel, the UK makes up 0.02%. So we're dwarfed by what the US sells to Israel. Germany, Italy are higher as well. So yeah, it wouldn't mean that the IDF grinds to a halt in Gaza, but it would send out quite a powerful geopolitical message as well. And I think you're right that there is the sort of technical side of this, in that if there has been a legal sort of finding of fact made that weapons licensed for export by the UK are being used in infringements of international human rights, then the sort of legal process kicks in and the scope for the politics is reduced. The difficulty is that there's so much murkiness, and finding a sort of explicit finding of fact that something has been used to break international humanitarian law is a lot easier said than done.
Rob, there's all sorts of elements to this. You've got the legal aspect, you've got the geopolitics, but what about the domestic politics? What are the parties saying here?
Domestically, we have had some, clearly on the opposition side, Labour, Lib Dems, SNP, calling for these legal judgments to be made public. Some opposition parties going further than others, calling for an outright ban for arms exports to be withdrawn immediately. You've also had these sort of non-party political figures from the foreign and defence establishment, people like Lord Peter Ricketts, who was the National Security Advisor, suggesting the same. So there's an awful lot of voices quite closely connected to the Foreign Office who are increasingly saying that maybe an adjustment in position needs to happen. The thing is, within the Tory party, I don't necessarily detect an overwhelming scramble for a toughening of position from the UK. And actually, when you speak to quite a few MPs, there is a not insignificant number of them that really think that the opposite should happen. You've had Suella Braverman in Israel, former Home Secretary, today talking about how that would represent abandoning Israel. One backbencher that visited a couple of months ago that I was talking to this morning said that some people are forgetting what this is about. This is self-defense for Israel, who simply have to stop another 7th of October style attack. Look, on the other side, you've got Alicia Cairns, who's a sort of a senior person, Foreign Affairs Select Committee chair, who has said that she believes the government has already had that advice, saying that Israel is breaking humanitarian law, but they just aren't publishing it. I've just had a WhatsApp drop in from a Conservative colleague on her committee who said, no, the government shouldn't publish their advice, and no, they don't agree that arms export licences should be suspended either. So there is quite a lot of division within the Conservative Party on this. I think maybe the determining factor and what is sort of occupying the minds of Rishi Sunak and Lord Cameron, though, is maybe less party management, although that might be a factor if they decided to do this, but more the signal that it sends out across the world if the UK does decide to do it.
This has happened before, and it's happened under a Labour government. It's also no less a figure than Margaret Thatcher, who previously suspended arms sales to Israel. She was reportedly furious at their invasion of Lebanon in the 80s. So this idea, it's interesting you said abandoning Israel, that's how it's perceived. It's not the idea that we could use our small political position, because again, like you say, it's not going to stop the IDF launching their operations, but actually that even any sort of pushback is perceived as abandoning Israel rather than perhaps sending a message about how we'd like them to behave, a message we've already made public. Lord Cameron's talked about this, how he wants a ceasefire, how he wants more aid into Gaza, but they wouldn't actually go as far as actually to do that political gesture of suspending or even just looking at arms sales.
And that's the point that people like Peter Ricketts, the former National Security Advisor, make, that they say this wouldn't be seen globally, he doesn't believe, as abandoning Israel. This would be seen as a sort of tangible reaction, more than just words, to the large number of civilian casualties we've seen in Gaza. It would be seen as a reaction to the 7 aid workers that were killed as well. In terms of when suspension of arms export licenses have happened before, you're right, 1982, Israel's invasion of Lebanon, 2002 as well, during operations that were taking place by the IDF in the West Bank. I think maybe the difference and the reason why a lot more thought and why this would be maybe a bigger thing is because of October the 7th, one of the biggest atrocities since the Holocaust in terms of loss of life for Jews. So I think that's potentially why it's a bigger call this time round. Whether it sways any other countries on a global level, I think is very much debatable, though.
In this letter, they do also talk about October the 7th and that violating international humanitarian law. They talk about the hostages that Hamas are still holding, call for them to be released. But they say the possibility of a genocide, something Israel denies, supersedes that, and that's why the government needs to act. All those sort of provisos aside, I just wonder how much the death of those aid workers, the killing of those aid workers by Israel Defense Forces has perhaps shaped things in a new direction.
I think it's maybe focused minds within the UK government. I think within the Conservative Party, the position with regards to what's going on in the Middle East is maybe less divisive and controversial than it is within Labour. But I think it's been interesting to see the tone toughen and ramp up from David Cameron, Lord Cameron, over the last 6 months. And I don't think it's been lost, particularly on Labour, that in some cases it looked like the Foreign Secretary was going further than Keir Starmer was on condemning what was going on, the civilian loss of life and such. And I think maybe this is factoring into it as well, as far as the sort of political part of this, that actually some of the comments coming out from Lord Cameron have irked some backbench MPs. I think in January he gave a speech where he talks about recognition of a Palestinian state. And that led to something of a backlash from MPs who said, look, this is essentially rewarding terrorist atrocities given what happened on October the 7th. So they need to be careful on this, because I think there are some, far from thinking that the position needs to harden, are already sort of worried about some of the tones coming out from the Foreign Secretary as it is right now.
Labour's position in this, when they're calling for that legal advice to be published, is, I mean, it's fair to say, nuanced is, the politer way of putting it. I'm sure there's people on the left who would say, we're absolutely not committing to a side either way. Do you think that can last?
I think what's determining the Labour position is less domestic politics and more international politics. They are thinking about the positions they take now and whether he can sit down as Prime Minister after the next general election, if that is what's going to happen, and make phone calls with Benjamin Netanyahu, make phone calls with other close allies of Israel. Nuanced is probably the generous way of putting it. Others would say sort of vague and fudgy maybe. I think at some point there will be many within the Labour Party that would like to see Sir Keir Starmer go further than the government, do something that doesn't look like kind of triangulation around the government position and the position of allies like New Zealand and Canada, because so far the Labour position seems to have mirrored the sort of broad Western position with regards to Israel. And I think that is what we are seeing right now. Labour are not calling for a suspension of arms export licences. Their position is that they want the legal judgment to be published, and that if it is found that there is a risk that arms licensed by the UK could be used to breach international humanitarian law, then that cannot happen. But again, that's quite caveated, and that is very far from some of the other opposition party positions, which is basically that when you look at the death toll, when you look at what is going on right now, that they find it unfathomable that UK licensed arms are even going there now.
Rob, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
In a moment, I'll be speaking to the barrister Michael Mansfield KC about his reasons for signing the letter and why he thinks the UK is in breach of international law. Welcome back. Now, as we were hearing from Rob Powell earlier, there's not much clarity in what the political parties want, what people inside those political parties want. But over 600 lawyers and academics have signed this letter that warns, and this is very legalese, so bear with me, but given the International Court of Justice's opinion that there is a plausible risk of genocide in Gaza, that the UK is legally obliged to act in preventing it. So this letter then goes on to say that, quote, serious action is needed to, quote, avoid UK complicity in grave breaches of international law, including potential violations of the Genocide Convention. Now, it's also worth mentioning that Israel, of course, flatly rejects the charge of genocide. Now, Michael Mansfield KC is a self-described radical lawyer who's won some massive, very famous human rights cases and has signed that letter.
I signed the letter because the situation is beyond dire. It's being called catastrophic and so on by all the authorities that looked at it. And there has been 2 decisions by the International Court of Justice for provisional measures which effectively should be brought about by a ceasefire. The United Nations has also called Security Council, very unusual for them to do. They've agreed there should be a ceasefire. And that is why the time has come for those lawyers who spoke out last autumn speak out again. There's over 1,000 of us.
A lot of this isn't that new. So I'm wondering, how much did the deaths of the 7 aid workers who were killed by the IDF make you want to sign this letter?
This was a convoy that had been communicated. The information had been communicated. The nature of the vans or being used had been communicated to them. So they knew full well, within the context of that, you have a provision in which you send in a peacekeeping force. Now, it seems to me aid workers are quite entitled. They're protected individuals. Leave aside anybody else. They're protected as well as civilians. If the occupying force, which is Israel, can't protect them, to say it's an accident, I'm afraid it's not a satisfactory explanation. It's in part of us where there's been a demilitarization zone. They don't actually call it a non-conflict zone, where this was also leaving a particular aid situation. Israel's got all the machinery for finding out. So it knew, we say, pretty well that people on the ground, I'm afraid, I've been given a free hand because they'll always say it's a self-defense and they'll always deny everything. But it seems to me the point has been reached in which the UN should be considering a peacekeeping force to prevent the annihilation which is going on at this minute.
That's probably beyond the scope of the letter of peacekeeping force, but just to pick up on that, I mean, we will see that investigation. I think what's different about this investigation compared to previous investigations, we've reported on medical facilities, for instance, by Médecins Sans Frontières being hit and investigations being promised. This is promised within the next few days, and it is promised to some of Israel's allies, especially. So I think that's going to have to be a lot more open than we've seen. But when it comes to that prevention idea, again, just on that International Court of Justice definition, the UK government would say, well, look, we want a ceasefire too. We want the same things that this letter is calling for. When it comes to arms sales, is that going to prevent anything, given how small UK arms sales are to Israel?
First of all, the government, through Lord Cameron, has already said they're considering the lawfulness of providing weapons or components of weapons that run the risk of, they're liable of being used in potentially genocidal situation. However, it isn't just about munitions, because there are lots of other ways in which we should be considering sanctions. For example, a bilateral treaty is being worked out, trade, if you like, and general relationship with Israel. You've got to look at other aspects of this, because what the international law is saying, you can take all reasonable steps. One of them is sanctions. And two, you don't have a close relationship with somebody who's committing this kind of potential crime. If you want that always to be qualified in that way. But, as I say, it's got a bit further than that. So although there's been a concentration on munitions, and I accept that in terms of munitions, we're way below the US, Germany, and I think Italy. I'm not sure. There are other countries that provide a lot of weapons. But it's more than weaponry. It's about a political relationship with a country that is basically disrespecting international law.
Even if the UK does everything you want this letter to do, it does what Canada does and says it's going to stop arms sales. What difference ultimately do you think that makes?
Either we go back to gun-backed diplomacy and might is right, or we pass into what was supposed to be a new horizon after the Second World War. That was to prevent exactly this sort of situation accelerating in the way that it has from the atrocity of October the 7th. I appreciate that, as through to another atrocity now. So in relation to that, the letter is intended to say, these are all people, it's over 1,000 signatories now. These are all people who've considered, we're lawyers, we've thought about it, we practice the law, we do not practice walking around to our neighbors and thumping them. So therefore, if you're wanting the civilized way, the civilized route, the peaceful route, then my submission is you've got to make the effort of putting it all out in writing, spelling it out, and asking for sensible debate, rather than just getting on with it and assuming that if you've got a bigger bum than somebody else, you can get away with it.
Isn't that quite a luxurious position to have, talking about in terms of a civilized way of doing things? As you say, October the 7th wasn't civilized, and Israel would say, look, Hamas is hardly going to be signing open letters and doing this. We have a right to defend ourselves. This is war. Civilians sadly die in it.
This is law of the jungle. I'm not sitting in some sort of, ivory tower. I was born during the Second World War. I was born during the Blitz. And the whole point at the end of the Second World War, everybody agreed we cannot allow this to happen again. Either we give up on humanity and we just say, if you think you've got a right to this, you can have it, but I'm not going to give it to you. You've got to come and get it with cudgels and guns. Well, sorry, that's not a society. And when I talk about a civilized society, I mean a society that's prepared to abide by the rule of law. Otherwise, the rule of law means nothing. International institutions mean nothing. Now, we can all run away, back away and say, oh, they've been hopeless. They haven't done anything. We'll just let the bombs take the count. I'm sorry, I'm not one of those.
Then how do you deal, if you want to abide by rule of law, with an organisation like Hamas?
You have debate. You have discussion. You put forward the ideas and you persuade without actually holding people to the ground with a rifle. You actually try and persuade governments. And I haven't given up on all governments yet, although it's getting pretty close to it. And I think I'm not alone in thinking that with an election coming up. The governments do have the power, and there are courts employed to enforce. The ICC, we haven't mentioned, the International Criminal Court, is there to do precisely that. But again, it can't get on with the job if governments are not prepared to support legal avenues. How do we get governments to do that? Because we have to do it by persuasion. Tell me of another way.
The letter specifically mentions that those hostages should be released. How do you negotiate if those hostages are still not being released?
Opinion is moving. And I'm a firm believer in the court of public opinion and persuading people properly that there are proper arguments for, in fact, involving a peacekeeping force who then would negotiate the release of hostages, as well as persuading the Israelis to allow more medicine, more food, prevent famine, prevent epidemics, all those things that have been put in the letter.
Thank you very much for joining us. That is all for today. See you tomorrow.
Eleanor Williams's claims that she'd been trafficked by an Asian grooming gang led to protests, racist attacks, and claims of a cover-up. Eventually, she was jailed for lying.
I don't want to be that girl that cries rape. I'm not that person.
I'm Sky News' Jason Farrell, and in Unreliable Witness, we ask, why did she lie? And explore unanswered questions with new revelations. Follow Unreliable Witness wherever you get your podcasts.